The Mystery of the Old Library. Chapter 1. A Rainy Afternoon. It was a rainy afternoon when Emma decided to visit the town's old library. The sky was gray, and water dripped down the windows of her small house. She didn't have much to do at home, and the thought of spending the day in the quiet library with a good book seemed perfect. Emma grabbed her umbrella and walked towards the library. She loved the sound of the rain tapping on the roof and the fresh smell of wet earth. The old library was located in the center of town, a big stone building with ivy growing up its walls. Hardly anyone visited it anymore, but Emma found comfort in its dusty shelves and old books. As she entered, a cold breeze blew in behind her. The librarian, Mrs. Johnson, was sitting at her desk, reading a thick book. She smiled warmly at Emma and waved her hand. "Welcome back, Emma. Looking for another mystery to solve?" Mrs. Johnson joked. Emma smiled back. "Maybe. I love this place. It always feels like there's a secret waiting to be found." Little did Emma know that today she would stumble upon a real mystery. Chapter 2. The Locked Room. Emma wandered through the library, running her fingers along the old book spines. She loved the smell of old paper and the creaking sounds the wooden floor made with every step. The library had many rooms, but one door always caught her attention. It was an old, locked room at the end of the hall. The door was made of dark wood, with an ancient lock and a sign that said, "No entry." Every time Emma passed it, she wondered what was behind the door. She had asked Mrs. Johnson once, but the librarian only smiled and said, "Oh, that's just for old things. Nothing interesting." But today, Emma felt curious. She reached out and tried the handle, even though she knew it would be locked. To her surprise, the door creaked open. Emma looked around. Mrs. Johnson was still sitting at her desk, not noticing anything. Emma felt her heart race as she stepped inside. Chapter 3. A Hidden Passage. The room was dark and full of boxes. Dust floated in the air, and it smelled old and forgotten. Emma's curiosity grew. She pulled out her phone and used its flashlight to look around. There were books scattered on the floor and strange objects she didn't recognize. Then, something caught her eye. A small handle behind one of the shelves. Emma hesitated for a moment, but then reached out and pulled it. To her amazement, the wall behind the shelf started to move, revealing a narrow passage. "What is this?" Emma whispered to herself. Her heart was beating fast, but she couldn't stop now. She squeezed through the gap and found herself in a hidden hallway. Chapter 4. The Strange Book. The passage led to another room, smaller and much darker. In the middle of the room was a single table, and on it lay a large old book. Emma stepped closer. The book had a dark leather cover with strange symbols on it. She had never seen anything like it before. Slowly, she opened the book. Its pages were yellowed with age, but the writing inside was clear. It wasn't in English or any language Emma knew. It looked like a secret code. Suddenly, Emma heard a noise behind her. She quickly closed the book and turned around. Mrs. Johnson was standing at the entrance, her face serious. Chapter 5. Mrs. Johnson's Secret. "I see you found the secret room," Mrs. Johnson said softly, stepping into the room. Emma felt her face turn red. She wasn't supposed to be here. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Johnson. I didn't mean to." "It's all right, Emma," Mrs. Johnson interrupted, her voice calm. "There are things in this library that most people don't know about. But I think you might be different." Emma didn't understand what she meant. Mrs. Johnson walked over to the book and gently touched its cover. "This book," Mrs. Johnson said, "is very old. It contains secrets, old knowledge, and magic." "Magic," Emma repeated, her eyes wide. Mrs. Johnson nodded. "Yes, but it's not the kind of magic you read about in fairy tales. This is ancient, real magic, and it's dangerous in the wrong hands." Chapter 6. The Key to the Mystery. Emma listened carefully as Mrs. Johnson explained the library's hidden history. Long ago, the library wasn't just a place for books. It was a place where scholars studied ancient magic and secret knowledge. The book Emma found was the key to many of these secrets. This book, Mrs. Johnson continued, contains spells and codes that unlock powerful knowledge, but it's written in an ancient language. Only a few know how to read it. Emma's eyes widened. "Can you read it?" Mrs. Johnson nodded slowly. "Yes, but deciphering it will take time. And we must be careful. There are others who would do anything to get their hands on this." Chapter 7. Unraveling the Code. For the next few days, Emma and Mrs. Johnson worked together to decode the mysterious book. Emma was fascinated by the strange symbols and their hidden meanings. Some of the passages described forgotten spells, while others told of powerful artifacts hidden deep within the town. One evening, after hours of studying, Emma found something unusual. "Mrs. Johnson, look at this," she exclaimed, pointing to a passage. The librarian leaned in, her eyes narrowing. "That's a map," she whispered. "It shows a secret location beneath the library." Emma's heart raced. Could there be something hidden down there? Mrs. Johnson smiled. "There's only one way to find out." Chapter 8. The Treasure Beneath. Late at night, with the library closed, Emma and Mrs. Johnson quietly followed the map's instructions. They descended into the old basement, where the air was thick and damp. After moving a few heavy boxes, they uncovered a trapdoor, just like the map had shown. Emma's hands shook as she opened the door. Beneath, it was a stone staircase leading down into darkness. With a deep breath, they descended, finding themselves in a large underground chamber. In the center of the room was an old chest, covered in dust and cobwebs. Mrs. Johnson stepped forward and carefully opened the chest. Inside were ancient relics, scrolls, and a shimmering crystal. Emma stared in awe. They had discovered a library's greatest secret, an ancient treasure that held untold magic and mystery. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed, please like and subscribe. See you next time.